Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea forecast to see another day with a huge number of new COVID-19 infections. Experts projecting around 170,000 cases for the second straight day. The Education Ministry also expects massive outbreaks of Omicron when the school year starts next month. Fears ramp up of a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. US officials claiming an invasion could begin at any time. The separatist regions at the heart of the crisis ask Moscow for help repelling Ukrainian forces. The West has imposed sanctions on Russian banks and billionaires. Plus, South Korea's central bank to decide whether to raise or freeze the benchmark interest rate. Many analysts expect a freeze, but a hike from the current rate of 1.25% would be the first time the Bank of Korea has hiked the rate 3 times in as many months.
Hello and welcome to this Thursday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m., February 24th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kim Dae-jung.
And I'm Mark Bream. Over the next hour, we will be taking a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. We start, though, with the COVID-19 situation on Thursday. South Korea expecting to see new daily COVID-19 infections top 170,000 yet again.
With Omicron sweeping the country, authorities continue to advise people to get vaccinated, saying the fatality rate drops significantly if people get a booster. For more on this, our reporter Choi Min-jung is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
So for today, we're expecting another record high.
Right, Mogan, the daily tally has surpassed 161,000 cases up to 9 p.m. Wednesday for another all-time high for this time period. The figure was up over 3,300 cases from the day before and almost double compared to last week, so passing the 170,000 mark today is likely. Despite cases surging, Daegu City in Gyeongsang-do Province is no longer requiring people under 60 to show vaccine passes to enter restaurants and cafes. The Daegu District Court suspended the vaccine pass mandate after some 300 people filed against the measure, judging it a violation of the basic rights of unvaccinated people. It's the first time that vaccine pass mandates have been blocked at restaurants and cafes for adults in the country. Elsewhere, vaccine pass requirements for adults were lifted for places like department stores and supermarkets only.
Yeah, those restrictions are still in place for cafes and restaurants in most other cities here in Korea, including Seoul. But as these cases continue to seemingly spiral out of control, the authorities are still urging people, if they've only had 2 shots of the vaccine, to get boosted if possible.
Right, authorities say the fatality rate of Omicron drops to the same level as the seasonal flu if people receive booster shots. Recent studies showed that the death rate for those boosted was at 0.08%, and knowing that the fatality rate for the seasonal flu is around 0.05 to 0.1%, Omicron can be seen as equally as dangerous as the flu if people get the extra shots. Over the past 2 years, around 7,600 people died of COVID-19, but authorities estimate that around 3,000 to 5,000 people die of the flu over the course of just 1 year. However, this isn't the case for the unvaccinated people. The fatality rate for people who aren't vaccinated jumps to 0.5% with Omicron, which is 5 times that of the seasonal flu. So authorities are saying that more people should get vaccinated, the faster COVID-19 will become endemic.
Now, staying with the vaccination front, on Wednesday, authorities here in South Korea gave the green light for Pfizer's vaccine to be administered to children. When will it start?
Right, Morgan, authorities said they will announce details sometime in March after consulting with experts. So we're expecting vaccinations to begin in late March or early April. And given the vaccination rate for the youngest eligible age, which is 12, has not even reached 10%, authorities predict that the rate of younger children will be equally low. So they say it will be important to come up with a strategy that suits younger kids. And just to recap, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety on Wednesday approved the use of smaller doses of the Pfizer vaccine for children aged 5 to 11. And the shot has been shown to be 90% effective against COVID-19, with no severe reactions reported in clinical trials.
Right, we must stress that it is up to the parent, and every parent has the choice to make their own decision. It's their own kids, after all. In regards to kids, the new school year starts in South Korea in March, but a lot of parents are really scratching their heads about what exactly the antivirus prevention measures are going to be.
Right. Schools will decide themselves whether to hold in-person classes or go with remote learning. And originally, education authorities advised schools to bring students back to classrooms. But with infections soaring, the education minister expects a surge in student infections in March, prompting allowing schools to switch to online learning for the first 2 weeks. Many schools, though, have yet to decide, and parents, especially those who work, are finding waiting for a last-minute decision troublesome. Some are also opposed to regular rapid antigen tests as they may scare their children. So in response, the Seoul Metropolitan Office of Education said it plans to introduce rapid PCR tests using saliva instead, although health authorities have not yet formally approved these tests.
All right, Min-jung, thank you as always for your report. Talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Moving on, the World Health Organization will establish a global biomanufacturing training hub here in South Korea to serve all low and middle income countries looking to produce medical equipment and treatments such as vaccines.
The WHO's move comes after the successful establishment of a global mRNA vaccine technology transfer hub in South Africa. The facility in South Korea will provide technical and hands-on training on operational and goods manufacturing practice requirements. The academy will also work with South Korea's Ministry of Health and Welfare to develop a comprehensive curriculum on general biomanufacturing. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden has pressed ahead with imposing sanctions on the company behind the Russian-connected European energy project, Nord Stream 2. The move comes as a senior American official says Russian forces around Ukraine are as ready as they can be to launch a full-fledged invasion. Kim Hyo-sun reports.
Adding to the penalties on Russia for its recognition of 2 breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, the U.S. has imposed sanctions on the company in charge of building Moscow's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The White House said Wednesday that it has imposed sanctions on Nord Stream 2 AG, a registered Swiss company whose parent company is Russia's state-run energy giant Gazprom. A senior U.S. defense official explained the same day that Russian President Vladimir Putin has put 80% of the troops he has assembled in a position to launch a possible full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Quoting the unnamed official, CNN reports more than 150,000 Russian forces are now assembled around that country. It added some of the troops are as little as 5 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. In response, Ukraine's parliament has approved a national state of emergency. Kiev also says several of its government websites were down as a result of a massive cyber attack. It targeted the website for the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Parliament, as well as some local banks. Ukraine also appealed to the UN General Assembly on Wednesday to halt what it called Russia's aggressive plans.
Active diplomacy, strong political messaging, tough economic sanctions, and strengthening Ukraine can still force Moscow to abandon aggressive plans.
In Europe, EU leaders will hold an emergency summit on the crisis. Thursday's meeting comes on the heels of a sanctions package announced by the 27-member bloc that includes limiting Moscow's ability to raise capital within the EU's financial markets. Kim Dae-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea's producer prices bounced back last month after they remained virtually flat in December. According to the Bank of Korea Thursday, the producer price index stood at 114 in January, up 0.9% from the previous month. Compared to a year earlier, the reading was up 8.7%, rising on year for the 14th consecutive month. The central bank attributes the rise to higher costs of industrial goods such as coal and petroleum products, which are affected by rising oil and raw material prices. The Bank of Korea will hold a policy meeting in the coming hours to decide whether to freeze or possibly increase its key interest rate, which is currently sitting at 1.25%. Now, the general consensus among analysts is that the central bank is likely to opt for a freeze due to the surge in Omicron cases. They also assume a third straight hike could dampen the current recovery trend. The rate has been raised by 25 basis points twice in a row during the past 3 months. If the Bank of Korea raises the rate later, it will mark the first time for the country to see 3 consecutive back-to-back hikes. Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. All of England's COVID-19 rules will be lifted from Thursday after UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson set out his government's plan for living with the virus without any restrictions on people's lives. With it, England, just England for now, not Scotland or Wales, will go back to the same levels of freedom enjoyed before the pandemic.
There will no longer be any requirement to self-isolate following a positive test, whether someone is vaccinated or not, but they will be advised to stay home. And on top of that, the provision of free testing for the general public will cease from April 1st, and England's contact tracing program will wrap up on February 24th. For more, we're joined by Ben Cowling, Chair Professor of Epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong, who is actually in London right now. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So firstly, from a non-scientific point of view, how do your friends and family in England feel to be free, as Boris Johnson puts it, after almost 2 years in the lockdown? And as an expert on viruses, do you think the timing is right?
Well, I don't think there'll be a drastic change over the next few days as these things change. Life has been very much back to normal already in the past few weeks in the UK, but there is a noticeable change in the perspective that the UK government is now, it seems like it's saying the pandemic is over, and I think a lot of people are relieved, but there are people that are concerned that maybe this is a little bit too early because the cases are still pretty high. They're coming down, but they're still pretty high.
What's your own opinion, though? Do you think the timing is a little bit too early?
Well, because the cases are coming down, we know if we just stay as we are, if we keep the same measures in place, the cases will continue to subside, going down to a low level pretty soon. But with the measures being relaxed, if there's a major change in people's behaviors, we may see this wave take longer to finish. And that will be, as a result, there'll be more people getting COVID, more people in hospital and so on. So I think maybe it's a tiny little bit too early, but I understand that there's pros and cons of keeping the measures in place or relaxing them.
Right. And Johnson's rationale was largely financial, it seemed, when he gave his speech, saying that England could no longer really afford to keep spending as much as it is on the virus and prevention measures. Do you expect that after going through similar cost-benefit analysis that other countries are now going to start following England's lead on this?
It's really tough because it's really difficult to add up all of the different costs, not only of the interventions that are done, but also the costs of COVID. Not only people getting sick, potentially some people getting hospitalized, other people getting long COVID, and so on. So how do you add up all those different things and make an assessment? It's difficult. And I think one of the big things is the stopping the provision of free tests. To me, that's in particular one of the big measures that I think has maybe done a little bit too early.
Yes, and Professor, Johnson's critics also don't like the end to the free testing, as there are people that need to, budget down to the last penny. So do you think testing should continue to be free, or do you understand Johnson's argument about a line having to be drawn eventually?
Well, in the UK, lots and lots of people have been testing themselves, not only when they get symptoms, but they've been testing themselves before they meet their friends. Children in school have been testing themselves twice every week for quite some time. That's mostly going to stop now because the supply is going to dry up, and I don't think people will pay for them. They won't use them as much if they have to pay for them. So I'm not sure that it's quite the right time to do that. Although the test costs money, I wonder if it's actually a good use of money to limit transmission, to protect people's health and so on, particularly in schools. So I actually think it would be a good idea to keep providing free tests for some time longer.
And finally, the UK's chief scientific advisor has warned that COVID-19 is continuing to evolve and will probably continue to do so for at least the next couple of years, something to that effect. Do you agree with that sentiment to start with? And is it generally the case that when viruses mutate, that they become less and less dangerous over time, like we have generally been seeing with COVID-19?
Yeah, well, we've certainly seen that Omicron seems to be a little bit milder than Delta and what came before that. But I think we have to be careful because that won't always happen. Now we have Omicron BA2, which is slightly different. And I wonder if that's got some properties that make it a little bit more dangerous than the Omicron, the BA1 that's been around the world. And in the future, who knows what will happen? It's possible the virus will change to become a milder version of the virus, but it's also possible that it won't. It's possible that we'll have another strain in the future that's more serious just by chance. So we can't count on the virus doing what we want it to do. And I think we have to keep a very close eye on it. But because the level of population immunity is now getting higher and higher, I know in Korea you have a lot of cases right now, but that won't last. Fairly soon you'll see the other side of the curve. With a lot of immunity, COVID is going to pose less of a threat in the future than it has in the past.
Well, that's good to hear. Professor Colling, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now to the election front. With less than 2 weeks away until South Korea elects its new president, the nation's presidential candidates are ramping up their campaigns across the nation. On Wednesday, the ruling Democratic Party's candidate visited the traditional swing region of Chungcheong-do province, his father-in-law's birthplace. There, he appealed to local voters, calling himself the region's son-in-law. Kim Dae-jung reports.
While on his campaign trail on Wednesday, ruling Democratic Party of Korea's presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung reiterated his stance on prioritizing peace on the peninsula, using the Russian-Ukraine crisis as an example.
Because of the war in Ukraine, our stock market falls, global economy freezes. What will happen to our economy if there's a threat of war on our peninsula? Of course, it would be very bad.
With exactly 2 weeks to go until Election Day, candidate Lee spent a day in the Chungcheong-do provinces. He tried to endear himself by saying that he is the son-in-law of the region, as his late father-in-law is from Chungcheong-do. He also said the Chungcheong-do provinces are at the core of the nation's unity.
But we keep dividing the nation by regions, by gender. We shouldn't be doing this, should we? No divided country has ever been successful.
His other stops for the day included Sejong, a city in the region developed as the country's de facto administrative capital, but with work still to do. As former presidents from his party came up with the idea to develop Sejong as the nation's administrative capital, he pledged he would make sure Sejong City would be completed during his term, even pushing for an amendment to the constitution to make it official. The Chungcheong-do provinces always play an important role in any South Korean election. They're traditionally known as the country's swing vote region, as it has always been hard to forecast which direction voters will go. On Thursday, Lee will be staying in the region and end his day a bit earlier than usual to prepare for Friday's debate. Kim Dae-jung, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the main opposition People Power Party's candidate on Wednesday continued campaigning in the country's southwest. In a speech to potential voters, Yoon Suk-yeol vowed to carry on the spirit of former President Kim Dae-jung, upholding South Korea's market economy and liberal democracy. Lee Jae-myung reports.
A president that unites the conservatives and the liberals, the country's southeast and southwest. Promoting this vision, the presidential candidate of the People Power Party, Yoon Suk-yeol, headed to the southwestern island of Haedo. It's the hometown of former President Kim Dae-jung, who led the country in the late 90s and early 2000s and hailed from the liberal bloc, the opposite of Yoon. It was the first visit to the island by a presidential candidate from the conservative side. Yoon said he would adopt what he called the Kim Dae-jung Spirit of national unity.
The Kim Dae-jung Spirit is the spirit that unites the nation based on liberal democracy and the market economy. We must uphold this great spirit.
Yoon also headed to the nearby city of Mokpo, where President Kim had his political roots. The region leans strongly liberal, but there Yoon rallied support, saying that the Kim Dae-jung Spirit is not of a particular political bloc or region.
I believe that our party and I reflect the spirit more so than the Democratic Party and its candidate Lee Jae-myung. We aim to realize the spirit centered on liberal democracy and the market economy.
In line with his emphasis on the market economy, Yoon in a Facebook post said he will become a sales president, actively selling South Korea's competitiveness on the global stage. This marked Yoon's 7th visit to the Jeolla region so far, the most visits by a conservative candidate. An official with his campaign said it's a symbolic move reflecting a broader change in the party as a whole. A small but significant change has detected in local public sentiment too. Yoon's supporting public polls has recently been in the upper teens, which is higher than any previous conservative candidate.
Yoon Suk-yeol is likely to visit the Jeolla region at least once more before Election Day. His current plan is to hold a rally in a university area next month. The party is aiming for the final ratings of above 20% in the region. Young-in, Arirang News, Mokpo.
And the minor progressive Justice Party's Sang-jung on Wednesday strongly emphasized her pledge to improve the rights of disabled people in South Korea. The People's Party candidate, Ahn Cheol-soo, was in Ulsan and Pohang, promising to develop cities and their surrounding regions as key economic players on the national scene. Kim Dae-jung reports.
Justice Party candidate Sang-jung got an early morning start on Wednesday at Seoul subway station. She stopped by the site of a protest staged by civic groups advocating for the rights of the disabled. Candidate Shim said their protest was justified and promised to work to improve the lives of the disabled.
I will do my best to not only secure a budget for disabled mobility rights, but also to make a society where all disabled people can live with their right to housing and their right to work guaranteed.
She continued her campaign trail through Seoul and Gyeonggi-do province, asserting that she's the candidate that will stand on the side of the struggling, small business owners, the impoverished, and workers.
I, Sang-jung, will bring a major shift where the fruit of 70 years of progress can be shared with the countless underdogs of society.
Meanwhile, candidate Ahn Cheol-soo put an emphasis on his plan for regional development.
After campaigning in Busan the previous day, candidate Ahn Cheol-soo from the People's Party continued his campaign trail through Ulsan and Gyeongsang-do province on Wednesday. He's pledging to turn these regions into one megacity that has an integrated economy and better transport links.
If the Busan, Ulsan and Gyeongsang-do area becomes the second capital, the second economic hub where people come together, our country will be able to develop in a regionally balanced way.
Ahn also touted his expertise in science and medicine, saying that the person leading the country needs to be familiar in many areas of study.
Who is the candidate that knows science and technology best? Also, there's one candidate who used to be a doctor, one who can best stop a new virus like COVID-19.
Candidate Ahn Cheol-soo's wife on Wednesday also campaigned in Gyeongsang-do province to add support. Kim Dae-jung, Arirang News.
South Korea's presidential candidates are a day away from another televised debate hosted by the National Election Commission, but on Thursday they continue on the campaign trail. Ruling Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung will be in Chungcheong-do province, highlighting his family ties to that region. Main opposition People Power Party candidate Yoon Suk-yeol in Gyeonggi-do province, joining party members and his supporters. The Justice Party's candidate, Sang-jung, will continue to appeal to workers with a day meeting labour unions. The only thing on the agenda for Ahn Cheol-soo of the People's Party is a National Election Commission meeting in the morning. The candidates are likely to spend the rest of the day preparing for Friday's debate. Now, as voting in the presidential election has started for South Koreans living outside the country, the candidates are appealing to them directly. Their pledges include making it easier for them to access services here in South Korea, to more easily exercise their right to vote, and deal with government agencies more easily when they're abroad. Lee Jae-myung reports.
Overseas voting began on February 23rd and will continue until the 28th. For some 226,000 eligible voters outside of South Korea, presidential candidates have come up with platforms and campaigns that are specifically for those who are overseas. All four major candidates have promised to establish a one-stop center for the various needs of overseas Koreans who until now have had to deal with a myriad of different agencies for taxes, consular affairs, education, and more. Such a center would be set up under the Framework Act on Overseas Koreans, which exists in draft form. Its passage has been pledged by candidates Lee Jae-myung of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol of the main opposition People Power Party, and Sang-jung of the minor Progressive Justice Party. Candidate Ahn Cheol-soo of the People's Party said he would establish a one-stop center too, but would first set up a presidential committee. But they've not yet proposed specifics. That's led to questions because similar plans were promised in the last election but were never brought to fruition. The heads of overseas Korean groups have said that they would like to have an organization under the office of the Prime Minister. Lee Jae-myung of the Democratic Party appealed to overseas voters Tuesday in a video on social media.
As president, I will overcome the difficulties of COVID-19 and make our country one of the top 5 economies in the world. I will create a South Korea that you can feel prouder of.
He also promised to pass the Framework Act, expand their voting opportunities, boost education for them, support their resettlement in Korea, and better protect Korea's cultural heritage abroad. The same day, overseas voters were addressed in a video from the People Power Party featuring an AI version of its candidate, Yoon Suk-yeol.
I am AI Yoon Suk-yeol. The Yoon Suk-yeol administration will work together with overseas Koreans for South Korea's global future. For another energetic day, let's go.
He promised more support for Koreans doing business overseas and for the participation of overseas voters, as well as more opportunities for them to learn, work, and invest in Korea, and to strengthen ties with Koreans who've been adopted abroad. The Justice Party's Sang-jung, meanwhile, shared on social media her concerns about Koreans in Ukraine. She also said that overseas Koreans have been at the forefront of change in South Korea and that the country needs a kind of politics that will overcome the climate crisis, inequality, and discrimination. Shim also promised to pass the Framework Act on Overseas Koreans and to revise the Immigration Act. In terms of voting, she pledged to expand ballot access through postal voting and by supporting educational institutions. The candidate of the People's Party, Ahn Cheol-soo, said that South Korea's place in the world will depend on who becomes the next president. He said overseas Koreans are civilian diplomats and proud national assets, and he pledged to work to improve and support their rights. Ahn promised to set up a rapid crisis response system, expand embassy call centers, and establish a system enabling overseas Koreans to contact the Korean police who can reach out on their behalf to the police in the country where they live. 이시후, Arirang News.
My family are in Korea, so if they are harmed by certain policies, we are affected too.
South Korea's runaway real estate prices are a big issue these days. I hope ordinary citizens can afford houses.
Because I live abroad, I'm interested in pledges that support the active participation of Koreans living abroad in politics.
South Korea is my motherland. When our motherland is well off, we don't get looked down on.
If the country prospers further, it helps people who live abroad run businesses and offers more opportunities when working abroad.
Pledges made by the presidential candidates should all be realized.
The president leads South Korea, so should not be swayed. I hope a good president takes the reins so citizens can live with hope.
We now cross over to our Oh Soo-young for Global Insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It is indeed time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. A UN expert called on the South Korean government to take a consistent approach to human rights in North Korea. Wrapping up his trip to Seoul, Thomas O'Hare-Quintana, UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights on Wednesday, highlighted the urgent need to address the ongoing abuses and violations of the basic freedoms, rights and necessities of people living under the Kim Jong-un regime. With engagement between the two Koreas and between the US and North Korea having stalled since 2018, efforts to push for progress on human rights in the North has been ever more difficult. Today, we speak with a scholar, journalist and activist who has been working tirelessly to expose and mitigate the human rights situation in North Korea. Greg Scolatu is the Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, also known as HRNK in short. He is also a visiting professor at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies, and for the past 19 years, he has authored and broadcast the Korean language Scolatu column for Radio Free Asia. Very warm welcome to you, Director. Thank you so much for joining us today.
A very good morning to you. Thank you very much. I'm honored.
It's our honor to have you on our program. And firstly, from restricting the freedom of speech, movement and religion in daily life to arbitrary detainment, execution, forced labor and prison camps, human rights in North Korea are described as rampant and systematic. And last December marked the 10th year since leader Kim Jong-un came to power. In your view, has the human rights situation in the North got better or worse over that time?
A February 2014 report by a UN Commission of Inquiry found that crimes against humanity were being committed in North Korea. Regrettably, the human rights situation has not improved under Kim Jong-un. Quite the contrary. The human rights situation has deteriorated. These developments include crackdown on border crossing, crackdown on information coming in from the outside world, crackdowns on the markets that have truly acted as survival mechanisms for the people of North Korea. And these developments have truly amplified under COVID, under the pretext of COVID for the past 2 years.
And one of the big focus areas for HRNK has been exposing North Korea's brutal concentration camps where tens of thousands of people are believed to be held even now. And who are typically held there, and what is life like for inmates of one of those camps?
One has to remember that there are multiple types of detention facilities. There are up to 120,000 political prisoners being held at Kwalliso political prison camp, men, women, and children, imprisoned pursuant to a system of guilt by association called Yeonjaje. They're subjected to a relentless, vicious cycle involving induced malnutrition and forced labor. Many of them simply waste away. Grave violations are happening in North Korea's Kyohwa-so re-education through labor camps, as well as short-term detention facilities. So basically, you're talking starvation, torture, executions, and a very, very severe lack of food.
And you recently wrote a piece in Foreign Policy on how North Koreans face human rights abuses when they leave their borders, as well as within their borders, as they escape to countries like China. And you also described how Chinese companies, they've been evading UN sanctions on North Korea, which enables more human rights abuses under the regime. How has the United States been addressing these kind of issues, and what further efforts would you like to see from the global community?
It would be extraordinarily important to persuade China to cease and desist its policy of forcibly repatriating North Korean refugees to North Korea. China is a party to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and its 1967 additional protocol. The standard applied here is that a refugee should not be returned to a place where she or he faces a credible fear of persecution. We have thoroughly documented that North Koreans return to North Korea from China. Remember, most of them are women, 70 to 80%. They have been subjected to extraordinarily cruel treatment, harsh interrogations, beatings, torture, imprisonment, and even executions. That's one big change that we could see there. Also, China continues to import North Korean minerals, North Korean coal. I'm not going to touch upon the UN Security Council resolutions that ban such importation based on a political security rationale, funds that go to North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. I will go to the human rights argument. The North Korean mineral and coal supply chain is tainted by the use of forced labor. Many detention facilities, including political prison camps, are located next to North Korean mines, and prisoners are forced to work in these mines under very harsh conditions.
And while the United States imposes sanctions against North Korea over its human rights abuses, in what ways has pressure worked? Has it actually improved human rights in North Korea?
It is very important to remind the despots of the world, especially those who refuse to abide by the rules of the international order, in particular human rights treaties and international human rights norms, that we know very well what is going on. And there will be a price to pay for oppressing and exploiting their own people at home and abroad. And this is one very important message, that the sanctions, US sanctions based on a human rights rationale as well, send to the North Korean regime. Has there been improvement on the human rights front in North Korea? Arguably in some areas, for example, disability. Mrs. Aguilar, the UN special representative for the rights of people with disabilities, visited North Korea a few years ago. She was not extraordinarily enthused. Nevertheless, this happened. Some of the detention facilities in the border areas with China have been closed down. Unfortunately, many of them have been relocated inland. This tells one that the regime of North Korea does know that the international community cares. After the UN COI report of February 2014, North Korea dispatched its foreign minister to the UN to speak at the UN in New York City for the first time in 15 years. So the North Korean regime is a terrible human rights violator, but it does take notice, and these efforts must continue.
Exactly. And well, Director Scarlatti, now some people see human rights as a domestic issue, and they believe that, especially when it comes to initiating dialogue with North Korea, they believe that denuclearization or peace needs to come first as an agenda. There are also concerns that raising human rights may only drive the North away, particularly when they're trying to talk about denuclearization. And well, do you think that the United States and North Korea can address human rights issues at the same time? Like, does it always have to be one or the other?
Absolutely. They can be addressed at the same time. We have been addressing only the very important, very difficult political, security, military issues, nukes and missiles, North Korean provocations, for almost 30 years now. Human rights has always been sacrificed on the altar of very important political security issues. Where did that take us? I would argue that perhaps it's time for a new approach that actually factors in North Korean human rights. We saw the very important action at the UN by a group of like-minded states after the UN Commission of Inquiry. And here I'm talking the United States, South Korea, Japan, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and others that came up with relevant and important measures on North Korean human rights. So I will argue in favor of including human rights in the issues addressed with North Korea. This is not simply a domestic issue. In today's day and age, in the year 2022, despots cannot just oppress and exploit their people with impunity in order to join the international community in the 21st century. And we surely hope that the DPRK, North Korea, will do that. They must do away with their political prison camp system. First, they must allow access to the UN, to the UN Special Rapporteur, to the International Committee of the Red Cross, why not to NGOs. They must proceed with dismantling these facilities. They simply do not belong on the Korean Peninsula. They do not belong in the 21st century.
And of course, Washington has countless foreign policy priorities. Right now, it might be Ukraine or China. But back when your organization started in 2001, of course, President George Bush was consumed with Middle Eastern affairs, and he began his war on terror. But throughout the years and throughout these different administrations, how did you manage to keep North Korea's human rights situation on the agenda for these different US administrations?
I work with an extraordinary group of board members and HRNK staff members. The first condition is dedication to what we do and belief in what we do. And our fundamental belief is that the 25 million people of North Korea need access to opportunity, need the opportunity to make their lives and the lives of their families better. It's important to be thorough. It's important to document. It's important to thoroughly research, document, and report on the North Korean human rights situation. Since access is limited, it's important to maximize our capitalizing on sources inside the country. It's important to work with North Korean escapees, and it is important to work in particular with satellite imagery analysis when it comes to documenting and reporting on North Korea's vast system of political imprisonment. It's very important to provide this type of information and analysis to decision makers. We do not lobby, we simply provide the necessary information in order to make relevant decisions. We provide this type of information to UN agencies, UN member states, the European Union. The other day, I met with a European parliamentarian from the Netherlands. Of course, we provide this kind of analysis and information to members of our US Congress as well.
Well, many are hoping for internal grassroots change in North Korea as well. But you said that there is a low degree of social cohesion within the North due to the very oppressive social climate that was generated by very harsh surveillance and punishment by the state. What then is the best way to empower North Korean people living under the regime?
That is absolutely correct. They have suffered from this never-ending cycle of coercion, control, surveillance, and punishment. The best we can do is to empower the people of North Korea. The best way to empower the people of North Korea is to send in information from the outside world. Tell them three fundamental stories. They're denied access to these three fundamental stories. The truth about the outside world, in particular free, democratic, prosperous South Korea. The truth about their own human rights situation, and also the truth about the corruption of their leadership. Let's say it in particular, the corruption of the inner core of the Kim family and other senior apparatchiks who have been maintaining the regime in power. And when I say empowerment, I do not imply any type of violent change. When I say that, I simply mean empowerment is the only way toward progress. All Koreans deserve much better. All Koreans really need to think of unification under a free, democratic, prosperous Republic of Korea. That dream should never be abandoned.
And Director, what do you hope to see from Seoul in order to advance human rights in North Korea?
We need to see South Korea retake the high ground it once held at the United Nations on North Korean human rights. We want to see South Korea participating and co-signing resolutions on human rights in North Korea that are passed in the General Assembly, at the UN Human Rights Council. We want the South Korean government to become once again a very active and dynamic promoter of human rights in the DPRK. We need to give a voice to North Korean escapees. They have been having a very hard time for a few years now. Their organizations have been defunded. Their voice is no longer heard as much as it used to be. Most importantly, going back to information, we need to empower the people of North Korea through information. There's only a limited number of vehicles that we have available. Radio waves, mobile media storage devices such as micro SD cards. Why not those leaflet balloons that have created such a controversy in South Korea? By removing one of these vehicles, this will have a negative impact on the availability of information in North Korea.
And Director, you founded the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea in 2001, and since then you've been, of course before then, so you've been working tirelessly to bring the situation to the world's attention and really mobilise efforts for change. Well, what first really drew you to North Korean human rights, and how were you able to keep going over the years despite the difficulties and, I imagine, the sort of darkness and the pressure that you must have faced as well?
The committee was indeed established 21 years ago by a group of most distinguished U.S. scholars, former government officials, and others with a deep concern for North Korean human rights, who realized that there was a gap in research and investigation on North Korean human rights. As far as I'm concerned, this is a very personal matter. I'm a naturalized American now. I was born and raised in communist Romania. I grew up on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I was a student, a freshman majoring in English language and literature at Bucharest University when the Ceausescu regime fell. I was right in the midst of it. Remember, Ceausescu and Kim Il-sung were really good friends, and Ceausescu was trying to turn Romania into the North Korea of Eastern Europe after he first visited Pyongyang in 1971. So it's a very personal issue. I, of course, went to South Korea as the first Romanian ever to end up there on a South Korean government scholarship. Very personal issue, having been born and raised in the one country most similar to North Korea and Eastern Europe, and having spent 1 decade on a divided Korean peninsula, having studied, worked, and lived in South Korea, there is a huge debt of gratitude I owe to the people of South Korea. After all, I studied there on a South Korean government scholarship. And there's also a sense of mission that I have lived under a similar system. And those 25 million people of North Korea do deserve much better. They do deserve access to a decent life governed by human rights and governed by access to opportunity. Very personal mission, let me put it this way.
And while you recently celebrated your 20-year milestone, and hopefully in the next 20 years, we will see you, I'm sure we'll see you continue to be at the forefront of human rights in all of Korea. And well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we must leave it. That was Greg Scolatu, Executive Director of HRNK. Thank you so much for your time.
A great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Tokyo and Beijing are facing a diplomatic row after an unnamed Japanese diplomat was briefly arrested on Monday for what China called inappropriate activities without explaining further. In response, China's acting ambassador in Tokyo was summoned to the Japanese Foreign Ministry as Japan demanded an apology. Japan accused China of violating the Vienna Convention, which bars the arrest of accredited diplomats in most situations. Meanwhile, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying told reporters on Wednesday that China has made a stern complaint with Japan, urging it to respect China's law, strictly restrain its consular staff in China, and prevent such incidents from happening again. She added that the Japanese diplomat had engaged in activities inconsistent with their capacity in China, while relevant Chinese department conducted proper investigation of the matter. There have been several cases of arrests in the past involving Japanese citizens over allegations including spying. However, it's extremely rare for a case to be brought against diplomats or government officials. A group of American truckers began their cross-country drive from California to Washington, D.C. on Wednesday to protest against COVID-19 restrictions. Inspired by a similar demonstration that paralyzed Ottawa for weeks, more than 24 18-wheelers, along with some 50 pickups and recreational vehicles, began their convoy. Dubbed People's Convoy, the group will take on an 11-day trek to demand an end to COVID-19 vaccine and mask requirements. Meanwhile, preparations are being made in Washington for the arrival of the convoy and other similar protests in the coming days. The Pentagon announced that it had approved 400 National Guard troops to help at traffic posts from Saturday through March 7th. The protest comes despite most U.S. states having already eased many restrictions. In California, where the convoy began, the state lifted universal mask requirements last week, with masks now only required for high-risk areas such as public transit, schools, and healthcare venues. Amid rising tensions between Russia and Ukraine, a number of landmarks throughout the world have been illuminated in Ukrainian colors to show support for the country. These include Berlin's Brandenburg Gate, which was lit in the blue and yellow of the Ukrainian flag. Berlin's state minister said the move is a show of solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Also, over in Paris, the city hall was lit up in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, as the city's mayor and left-wing presidential election candidate Anne Hidalgo was seen showing support. Peruvian archaeologists have unearthed 8 children and 12 adults that may have been sacrificed some 1,200 years ago. The remains were found outside an underground tomb, where archaeologists from Peru's San Marcos University had found an ancient mummy in November. One archaeologist said the children and adults, some mummified and others skeletons, were wrapped in various layers of textiles and were part of an ancient ritual and had likely been sacrificed to go alongside the main mummy. The burial pattern has been seen before, such as at the tomb of the Lord of Sipan, a ruler from 1700 years ago, who was discovered along with children and adults who had been sacrificed to be buried with him. Peru is home to hundreds of archaeological sites of culture that developed before and after the Inca Empire. Lee Jae-myung, Arirang News.
Good morning. The last of the freezing winter weather to start across Korea this morning. Hope you're well bundled up again. But relief is in sight. Much improved temperatures start tomorrow. Well, this winter has been dominated by very dry weather. Korea has seen about 160 wildfires this season, which is double last season's number. And according to Korea Forest Service, most of our wildland fires are human-caused. Well, back to today's readings. Cold wave alerts remain in place across central regions, with Chungcheong at a low of about minus 13 degrees Celsius. But highs will rise fast, 10 to 15 degrees higher than today's morning temperatures. Seoul topping out at 4 degrees. Daegu will get up to 7 degrees this afternoon. Air quality will be normal during the day under mostly sunny skies, but things could get dustier at night with light precipitation in the forecast on Saturday. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
And that's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Friday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.